Well, hello, everyone. What you are about to watch or listen to is an excerpt from Session 2 of the Olive Tree pilot course, which we recently hosted live on Zoom. So this special series is part of the Bridge Builders Forum Olive Tree campaign, which is an initiative designed to help Christians do something many sincerely want to do, but often struggle to articulate. And that is how to stand against anti-Semitism and stand with the Jewish people in a deeply biblical way. Well, this campaign is built around the 10 Olive Tree Affirmations. These are 10 biblical statements inspired by the Apostle Paul's olive tree imagery in Romans 11. And these affirmations provide Christians with a clear biblical way to understand their relationship with the Jewish people and to strengthen their own identity. So in Session 1, we covered the first 2 Olive Tree Affirmations, which challenged the foundations of replacement theology. And here in Session 2, we cover Affirmations 3, 4, and 5, in which we press deeper and challenge anti-Jewish understandings of Judaism and the New Testament. And we also discuss the importance of engaging authentic Jewish voices to better understand both Jews and Judaism. So before you watch, I encourage you to visit bridgebuildersforum.com/olivetree and download the Olive Tree Affirmations. I think both Christian and Jewish listeners will be encouraged by what this campaign makes possible today and for the future we're working to build together. Building off of Affirmation 1 and 2, Affirmation number 3 is this: we affirm that Judaism was not a problem that Jesus came to solve. Again, I hope you have a copy of the Olive Tree Affirmations. If not, you can jump over to the Bridge Builders Forum website and grab a copy there, or just look along. But again, Affirmation number 3, we affirm that Judaism was not a problem that Jesus came to solve. Now, this affirmation right here, I think, is where, for many people that engage on whatever level they do with the Olive Tree Affirmations, I think this is going to be a significant fork in the road for some people. It has been, and I think many of you could very quickly, easily, and testify that it has been so deeply instilled within the theology, reflexes, and instincts of Christian teaching to see Judaism as the negative other. That's just instinctual, basically, because of how much and how naturally it's emphasized in the way that the New Testament, Christian theology, and the whole Bible is understood. Put differently, it's really second nature and a deeply ingrained paradigm for Christianity to frame Judaism as its foil, and very much to see Judaism and the Torah as a problem that Jesus, Paul, and the gospel came to solve. And this way of viewing Judaism really started very early. In the 2nd century even. Famously, the early church father, some of you may have heard of Ignatius of Antioch. So this is 2nd century. And he was the bishop of Antioch. Of course, Antioch has tremendous early history in church history, and we even see it in the New Testament as well, especially in Acts. So Ignatius was the bishop of Antioch, and he was quoted as saying, "It is monstrous to talk of Jesus Christ and to practice Judaism." So Ignatius was a very early Christian voice who spoke clearly and, I would say, harshly about Judaism. But as the centuries marched on, plenty more Christian voices would speak harshly against Judaism and frame it really as the heel, as like the heel of Christianity. And while direct attacks on Judaism, and again, please know that our heart and our objective here tonight is not to emphasize all the bad stuff. Of course, Christianity was doing a lot of really good stuff too. And so we're being very specific in the issues and the challenges that we're addressing here. But as the centuries marched on, and while direct attacks on Judaism, as we know, many of you are very familiar with the history, these attacks persisted. Some of the ways that Judaism was demeaned and just sort of became embedded in church thinking, it became a little more subtle. Often when Christians critiqued and criticized each other, if they really wanted to frame another Christian group, in negative terms, it became normative in the sources. I'm talking about like the church fathers and on from there. It became normative to associate a Christian group with Jews, Judaism, the Pharisees, or legalism. Essentially, over time, Judaism became a go-to reference point for Christians if they wanted to highlight something really negative that everybody understood represented a deviant form of religion and spirituality. Of course, famously, Martin Luther wanted to condemn what he saw as the Catholic Church's errors, and so he often framed his criticisms in Jewish terms. Speaking of the papacy in Rome, Luther once wrote that the papal authorities were worse than the Jews. And that insult worked because it was well established about what people already assumed about Jews and Judaism in a very negative way. And so while anti-Judaism is typically expressed in more, I would say, politically correct terms today, it is nonetheless alive and well. When modern Christians oftentimes want to criticize some kind of internal church practice or belief, it is often still normal to draw on terms that relate to Jews and Judaism. An example of this that I highlighted in my book, The Weird Apostle, is a recent book. When I say recent, it's like 10 years old, but it's a book called Pharisectomy. So I got a copy of it right here. Pharisectomy is the title of this book. And so this is a Christian book by a pastor. Now, if I told you, you might think, well, where'd you get that? Is that like some kind of obscure book that you found in a used bookstore that, for like $1 or something like that? No, that's not it at all. If I read the endorsements for this book, you would recognize names. Some of the most popular pastors in the United States endorsed this book. Okay. And so again, it's written by a Christian pastor. His name's Peter Haas. And it's a critique of the American church. To be very clear, this book is not written as a critique of Judaism or even the Pharisees per se. What this book does, though, is it associates the worst kind of Christian expression from the standpoint of the author. He associates that with concepts that are associated with Jews and Judaism. So the subtitle of the book here is How to Joyfully Remove Your Inner Pharisee and Other Religiously Transmitted Diseases. Pharisectomy. Okay, so it's really important that we understand the math here. This book directly associates Pharisees or Phariseeism as a religiously transmitted disease. I mean, that's clear right in the subtitle that I just read. And it's standard for both Christians and non-Christians to associate the Pharisees with Jews and Judaism. So what this kind of rhetoric does is it reinforces the idea. It creates a conceptual link that we don't even think about. It's just, you just naturally make these connections and assumptions, and it reinforces the idea because of that link between Jews, Judaism, Pharisees, and the worst kind of religion that's just so common. It just reinforces the idea that Judaism is a deviant religious expression, maybe the most deviant religious expression. And in Christian math, or in at least some, the way this is changing, thank God, as many of us know, but in, let's just say, traditional, historical Christian math, the equation is simple. Judaism was a problem, and Jesus solves that problem. Well, this affirmation number 3, the Olive Tree Affirmations, affirms the very opposite. Judaism was not a problem that Jesus came to solve. So let's dig into this affirmation a little bit further. And I want to look at the descriptive paragraph. Again, if you're looking at if you have a copy of it, or if you're looking at it online, of course, each one of these affirmations comes with a descriptive paragraph. And of course, with each component of the Olive Tree campaign, we've got the affirmations, but of course, the book's going to go a little bit deeper, and the course. So we press into all of these topics further and further with each of these components. But I'm going to read the descriptive paragraph. And it says, Judaism need not be inferior, legalistic, or obsolete for Christian claims to be compelling. Too often, Christians have conveyed that Judaism merely set the stage for Christianity and now must step aside, as if one faith's vitality depends on the other's disappearance. This pattern has fueled anti-Semitism for centuries, and it must come to an end. So, granted, this affirmation is framing things in a negative term. We're saying, look, Judaism was not a problem that Jesus came to solve. And affirmation 5 is sort of the other side of the coin here in a positive way. But what I think, again, the ultimate goal here with these affirmations is to help Christians to understand what it means in an anchored way. What does it mean to stand against anti-Semitism and with the Jewish people? Biblically speaking, we have to go deep into these things. And the reality is that we have to come to terms with, for the past 2,000 years, one of the biggest misconceptions about the gospel and about the emphasis of the New Testament is that Judaism was a problem that Jesus came to solve. But that math, again, we're talking about the math here. Truly, that math doesn't add up when we consider that both Jesus and Paul and other, disciples that we see, Jewish disciples in the New Testament, they practiced Judaism and they kept the Torah, which is, the Torah is, of course, the biblical engine of Judaism. So according to Paul, Jesus came to transform sinners into saints, okay, to put it, in a concise way. That is a central claim of the gospel. But what has been wrongly added to this idea to the gospel is the idea that Jesus and Paul canceled the law and started a new religion. As Jews who lived according to God's word, Jesus and Paul adhered. We see it over and over again. They lived a life in conformity with God's commandments as outlined in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, of course, known as the Torah. Now, very importantly, they didn't keep the Torah to earn their salvation. I know that many people, especially maybe not as much this group right here in the pilot, but people that are, as this circle goes further out, an objection that could easily rise, and we're going to address it right here in the course is, well, are you saying that, if you're saying that they kept Judaism, does that mean that they thought that keeping the Torah is what earned their salvation? That's not what we're saying at all. Rather, what we're saying is that Jesus, Paul, and many of the early Jewish Christ followers kept the Torah because the commandments were given to show Israel how to live a blessed life and to be a light to the nations. Friends, I think it's sad to say, but I think there are many modern churches where Jesus and Paul would not be accepted as members. And that's almost impossible for us to get our minds around. I mean, how is that even possible? Well, my point in that, of course, I'm being somewhat rhetorical, but maybe that's not such a far stretch. I make that point because, very importantly, I don't think Jesus and Paul would be rejected as members of modern churches because they were Jews. Okay, there's lots of Jews in modern churches, okay? I think Jesus and Paul would be rejected from most modern churches because they lived Torah-observant lives in accordance with Judaism. And within Judaism is how I like to put it. Again, they didn't view Judaism as a problem to be solved. They saw it as a life to be lived. Does that mean that they agreed with that all the Jews, of course, they had disagreements with other Jews about, especially once we get into like Acts and Paul and those there were plenty of disagreements about who Jesus was, but this was all taking place within Judaism and within respect for the Torah. So this reminds me of something, again, this broader point of this affirmation, Judaism isn't a problem that Jesus came to solve. It reminds me of something that Amy Jill Levine said. I had the opportunity, I'm sure many of you have heard of Amy Jill Levine. She's an Orthodox Jewish lady, and she's a New Testament scholar as well. And she's written a lot of books. She's just an amazing speaker and teacher. And I had the opportunity about 10 years ago to interview her in her office. And I remember that was the first time I heard her say, in this just kind of, good Northern accent. She just said it like a just so smoothly. She said, Christians don't need Judaism to look bad to make Jesus look good. I thought that was just a simple way to put it, and it's stuck with me ever since. So I would say, such oppositional framing between Judaism and Jesus, it's foreign to the gospel. And it's foreign to Paul if we understand him in his context. Again, clearly, in the New Testament, we have intra-Jewish debates, and we're going to be talking about that more tonight. We do have that going on, but these were debates that were going on within Judaism and within the assumption that Torah and a Torah way of life is still a very, very good thing and is not a problem. Okay. And so I think that, one of the ways I want to just give one example about that I think is a very typical way that this antithesis between the gospel and Jesus and Judaism, comes down to how Paul's Damascus Road experience is often framed. On the Damascus Road, you guys have heard this story a million times, but I think it's a really good one for those of you that are seeking to understand these concepts further and even share them with others. And hopefully at some point teaching helping others work through the Olive Tree course and affirmations. The Damascus Road is really a good example of what we're talking about here. Of course, the typical story is that when Paul encountered Jesus, he abandoned Judaism and started Christianity. And part of this narrative, Saul the Jew becomes Paul the Christian. But here's the problem. That's not the way Paul describes what happened on the Damascus Road, and it's not the way the book of Acts describes it either. On the Damascus Road, and here's a good line to remember. If you haven't heard me say this before, write it down because it's really significant. I didn't come up with this line, but here it is. Paul was called, but not converted. Called, but not converted. Such a simple little line, but it changes so much about the way we understand Paul, and the way we understand Paul is huge in how we understand all these issues. So, of course, on the Damascus Road, that flash moment, it changed his life, and he became convinced that Jesus rose from the dead and set in motion the prophetic hopes of the Jewish people. And so at that moment, we see, as we read about, Jesus assigned Paul a new vocation, but not a new religion. So Paul received the calling, the vocation to be the apostle to the Gentiles, but not an assignment to start a new religion separate from Judaism. And this is critical because for most of the past 2,000 years and even today, Paul has been misrepresented as a figure who thought Judaism was a problem that Jesus solved. And this framing of Paul and Judaism, my friends, it has cultivated and is still cultivating endless division and hostility between Jews and Christians. We know Paul continued to live as a faithful Jew within Judaism. I think the book of Acts makes that crystal clear. In Acts 21, James looks at Paul when he was being accused of, promoting ideas that were turning Jews away from Torah out in the diaspora. And James turns around and said, Paul, we know you yourself walk orderly, keeping the Torah. Acts chapter 21, verse 24. And I think if Paul could speak to the church today and share God's heart on these issues about his Jewish family, about the Torah, I really believe he would want Christians to show the love and respect for Judaism and the Torah that both he and Jesus had. In other words, I think Paul would want the church to see Jews and Judaism not as the negative other, but as a spiritual brother. Of course, siblings don't always see eye to eye, but they're family. And I think it's time for everyone in the family of Abraham, both Jews and Christians, to recognize Judaism was not a problem that Jesus came to solve. So, stated positively, for Christians who want to stand with the Jewish people, I think it's incredibly important that they see Judaism as a provision, not a problem. Hey, if you're enjoying this episode, I want you to know that the Bridge Builders Forum is more than just a podcast. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping Jews and Christians better understand their faith, the Bible, and each other. Your support helps us host these vital conversations and create educational resources and interactive learning experiences. And yes, all donations are tax deductible. To give, just visit bridgebuildersforum.com and click donate. Every gift makes a difference. And I want to thank you for standing with us. And if we can serve you in any way, send us a message. But let's move on to affirmation number 4, which is we affirm that using the New Testament to justify anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism is contrary to the gospel. So we affirm that using the New Testament to justify anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism is contrary to the gospel. All right, now, you may be wondering, why do we even need to say this? I mean, very few people in 2026 would disagree with that statement and with this affirmation. It's like, okay, yeah, I'll sign that, no problem, right? So the challenge is not with getting folks to agree with this affirmation. The challenge is with creating awareness regarding how much anti-Jewish and I would say also anti-Israel thinking is still evident in Christian teaching. In other words, there is still a tremendous lack of awareness of how anti-Jewish stereotypes and ideas continue to be perpetuated and advanced through the teaching and preaching of the New Testament. And friends, some of the reality is that some of the strongest defenders of the Jewish people from pulpits, so we're talking about Christian defenders of the Jewish people, I've often heard in messages and in books and so forth, hey, we stand with the Jewish people, we stand with Israel, but then in the preaching and teaching, typically completely unaware. Again, a lot of this, that's why I emphasize a lot of the problem with this, which we're going to dig into, is awareness and challenging some inherited ideas and concepts that we need to press into. So to highlight this, I want to, I posted about this on social media today. There's this book, and I think the term, there's part of me that doesn't like the term at all because of what it represents, but I think it's a really vivid term. It's called Judeophobia and the New Testament. Judeophobia. Now, this book is a tough read. First of all, it's an academic book. So if academic or scholarly reading isn't your thing, then this might not be the best book to invest in. But it's a really powerful book that goes through each book of the New Testament and talks about ways that it's been understood and interpreted still, and historically and in modern times, in ways that encourage or promote Judeophobia, which I'm going to explain that term a little bit more in just a moment. But I want to read an excerpt from this book that I thought was really powerful and worth sharing as we are talking about this point. And here's a quote from Judeophobia. It says, "It's clear that anti-Jewish idea." Oh, and by the way, one more thing before I read the quote. This book is very recent. I mean, this came out like last year. So this is very fresh, writing. So here's the quote. "It is clear that anti-Jewish ideas permeate much of the way that Christians read their scriptures, including that the Christian concept of grace should be automatically contrasted with the Jewish notion of law, that Judaism's purity laws and general attitudes towards women were misogynist and needed abolishing by Jesus, and that early Jews associated wealth with righteousness and therefore showed no concern for marginalized groups until Jesus came along and set things right. These anti-Jewish stereotypes are ways that Christians position themselves as better than Jews. In this way, such an inaccurate and dangerous misunderstanding of Judaism is reinforced when Christians read the New Testament without understanding the context in which it was written." So, simply stated, Judeophobia is a term, I think, that captures this idea of denigrating Judaism. And Judeophobia is alive and well, and in some ways growing in Christian circles. Now, I'll just give you even one example that happened this week. On Monday, a friend sent to me a video from a fairly popular YouTube Christian YouTube influencer who was did a whole teaching on Martin Luther's famous treatise on the Jews and their lies, one of the most anti-Semitic, writings that we have from, the last 2,000 years. And I mean, he was, this is a guy with a big audience, and there were hundreds of comments, and I started reading the comments because this guy was talking about how, he was saying Luther wasn't anti-Semitic. He's been misunderstood. And, what he's saying here about Jews is true. They just want to dominate the world. I mean, all these kinds of things. And I was not shocked by that there are people that have those viewpoints and promote that kind of nonsense. What I was shocked by is the number of comments and the number of people that were cheering him on. Like, hey, we need more of this. Yeah. I mean, it was just amazing, mind-blowing. So now I wish I could say, all right, that's just an isolated thing, but that's just not what my experience, and I think many of your experiences would say. Judeophobia is alive, well, and in some ways growing. Now, such anti-Jewish thinking is often, again, expressed unknowingly, and unintentionally in Christian teaching. And we have to keep that in mind. So many ideas that I would consider Judeophobic are not meant in what I would call an anti-Semitic way, right? So it's very possible to say something that is anti-Jewish or anti-Judaism or Judeophobic, but not be anti-Semitic in the sense of you hate Jews or you think that they are somehow inferior. So this is an important distinction. But again, I would say, as we discussed in affirmation number 1, this affirmation is essential, whether a Christian, for Christians everywhere. And that's because, here's the thing, perpetuating, whether we call it anti-Judaism, Judeophobia, whatever we call it, anywhere that is being perpetuated, whether it is a Christian community that lives near Jews or far from Jews, it not only negatively affects the relationship between Jews and Christians, which is important in and of itself, biblical in and of itself, but what it also does is this kind of thinking, it contaminates the inner self-understanding of the church and its understanding of the scriptures. So let's take a look at the explanatory paragraph that goes along with this affirmation, affirmation number 4, so we can gain further clarity on what we mean here and why this is needed. So, Jesus's and Paul's strongest critiques were intra-Jewish conversations. And I want you to, if you're taking notes, circle that or write intra-Jewish conversations, because it's a critical three critical words for understanding so much of what's going on at times in the New Testament regarding this topic. So Jesus and Paul's strongest critiques were intra-Jewish conversations, family debates within Judaism. When Christians remove these moments from their Jewish setting and apply them to Judaism as a whole, we distort Scripture, violate its historical and spiritual context, and end up wounding the Jewish people. Friends, simply stated, it is essential that intra-Jewish critiques found in the New Testament, and they're everywhere. We see Jesus and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and then we get over to the New Testament and Acts. I mean, they're beating the mess out of each other in all the time. But it's essential that these intra-Jewish critiques found in the New Testament do not continue to be framed as anti-Jewish criticism. So when this happens in Christian teaching, again, whether there's intentionality or awareness of it or not, it fuels a negative posture that Christians have towards Jews and Judaism. Okay? In other words, when Christians approach the numerous texts in the New Testament that record family arguments among Jews, it's critical that this context is remembered and that they not use these texts to draw general conclusions and timeless conclusions about Jews and Judaism. Now, I want to briefly mention two major New Testament texts briefly that have been misused to fan the flames of Judeophobia for many generations and even this week, or at least last week, probably this week too, but I'm thinking of an incident last week. So, I want to suggest how we can approach these texts differently today. So the two texts I'm going to refer to or highlight briefly are both in New Testament books attributed to John, and I'm going to be very honest. The New Testament books that bear John's name, so we're talking the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Revelation, also referred to at times as the Johannine or Johannine literature. These books do provide some of the most fertile ground for people who already have anti-Jewish biases, for them to find texts that fuel hatred towards Jews and Judaism. And arguably, John chapter 8, verse 44, if you've got your Bible, take a look at it or pull your phone up. John 8:44 might be the number one, historically speaking, the number one go-to text for those who want to demonize Jews. And I'm going to be honest with you, of course, it's a tough text. So in John 8:44, speaking of a group of Jews, one Jew speaking to another group of Jews or Judeans, depending on how you prefer to translate it, Jesus says, "You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires." Okay, so now you know which text. You've heard it before, right? And you've probably bristled before. Friends, this text has had lethal consequences for Jews since it was written. I would say not the text itself, how the text has been handled. And there's still, I would say, a lot of reflection that is still needed among Christians when it comes to this text. Now, one important reflection and reading that was highlighted in an excellent volume by Jesper Svartvik, and I'm a big fan. I had him on my podcast maybe 6-8 months ago. He wrote a book called Jewish Foundations of the New Testament, addressing the roots of anti-Semitism. And again, it's another book that's pretty heavy duty, but what I love about this book is he goes through 30 New Testament texts that have traditionally been used and understood in, I would say, Judeo-phobic ways, and he presents sort of the historical ways and then a much more positive, way of understanding these texts moving forward. And so I love Jesper Svartvik. But one important reflection that he highlighted is that he reminds us of Krister Stendahl his famous distinction between what the text once meant, and what it may now mean. Okay, Svartvik highlights that few, if any, biblical texts, demonstrate the necessity of this distinction more so than does John 8:44. So again, what do we mean by that? Well, here's the reality. John 8:44 was written at a time and recording a time of intense intra-Jewish context. There we are, back to that word. And we see intra-Jewish context in other Jewish texts in this period, lots of it, such as in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which pits the sons of light against the sons of darkness. I mean, lots of Jewish texts. It wasn't unusual for Jewish groups to bitterly attack each other. But the problem with this text, John 8:44, and others like it, is that it's often forgotten that these texts describe Jewish groups punching each other. Okay, and the way it's typically portrayed is, it's Jews versus Christians, but it's really Jews versus Jews, and this is a within intra-Judaism conversation that is going on. But what happened is we forget that these texts are Jewish groups punching each other. But when this text became holy for the primarily non-Jewish church, as decades and generations went on, this text, John 8:44, in many cases became a lethal weapon against Jews. Also, I think it's very important to remember, and this is related, John 8:44 is a highly situational text, and it isn't seeking. There's no intention in John 8:44 when Jesus says, "You are of your father, the devil," to characterize all Jews or all of Judaism for all time. But that context has often been forgotten. And this text has been pulled from its context and weaponized. And it's still happening today, even on my YouTube page. People comment all the time. All I have to do is post something, which I do all the time, about, Israel, the Jewish people, which is like every one of my episodes or something. And it's like John 8:44, they are of their father, the devil, because my content is usually challenging these readings and presenting, another way of looking at it. And John 8:44 is constantly brought up. Okay. So I think we have to remember what it meant in its context and what it now means. Okay. And I think that can really help us with all of these texts, what it means for believers and Christians today, and keeping that context in mind. Okay, now, and the second one, I promised two. So let's talk about the synagogue of Satan phrase in Revelation 2:9. It's another one that continues to be weaponized. Just last week, or a few weeks ago, Spencer Pittman, the young Christian man who set a Mississippi synagogue on fire, burned 2 Torah scrolls, did tremendous damage to a synagogue there in Jackson, Mississippi. He used this phrase when explaining his motivation for what he did. Again, we're not going to be able to explain this phrase or examine this phrase in detail, but I agree with a biblical scholar named David Frankfurter, who suggests that Revelation's synagogue of Satan reference refers to actually a group of Gentile Christ followers who assert that they're Jewish and claim an affiliation with Judaism without actually living a Jewish life. So that's, again, that would throw the way, that text has been used in a real, because the way it's typically framed is that, the synagogue of Satan is a group of Jews that are attacking Christians. Okay. And that's a very problematic way of looking at it. But look, here's the thing. Even if, as I had another podcast guest, Rebecca Haig, who did a fantastic job talking about the book of Revelation as a Jewish text. If you missed that, I highly recommend checking that out. And something Rebecca said was that even if the synagogue of Satan is is a, let's just say, a Jewish target. It's targeted at Jews. Again, the attack was likely an intra-Jewish argument about what it truly means to be Jewish. And in no way should this text be used by folks such as Candace Owens in reference to Benjamin Netanyahu, which she recently did. And I think regardless of whether one likes Netanyahu or not, to associate him with the synagogue of Satan is, that's demonizing. It's demonizing him. And that is a very dangerous thing to do. And I'd say this text should in no way inspire anti-Jewish attitudes or actions today. So it's critical to remember, before we move on here, it's critical to remember that these texts are the kinds of inter-Jewish critique that are common during, before, and after the New Testament era. So the bottom line, Jews say all kinds of harsh things about each other in the New Testament and other Jewish texts, but these are inter-family dialogues, and that context is critical. And I would say for Christians who want to stand with the Jewish people, it is essential to affirm. Again, now we're back to the actual affirmation itself. It is essential to affirm that using the New Testament to justify anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism is contrary to the gospel. And again, the issue there is the awareness part. All right, so let's jump into we're going to pivot to our last affirmation for tonight. Then we'll open the floor for some discussion. So affirmation number 5. And again, this one's very related to affirmation number 3, but it's put in just a more positive light. Affirmation number 5 is, we affirm that authentic learning requires engaging with Jewish voices, Jewish texts, and Jewish lived experience. Okay, friends, I would say, the way I like to put it is this may be the deepest gold mine that is awaiting Christians and the church. And many of you, I know, because I know a number of you, that are part of this meeting personally, many of you can strongly testify how much your faith as a Christian has been enriched by engaging Jewish sources and Jewish relationships. So let's discuss why this is so important. Now, you may have noticed in the Olive Tree Affirmations themselves, the explanatory paragraph of this affirmation is actually 2 to 3 sentences longer than most of the other ones. So I just, we added a little bit more, and I had some people give some input, and I was just like, oh man, we need to keep all of this in there. So it's a little bit longer. So, but of course the question is why? And so, again, we'll be able to pack, we'll have the course and the book, but I felt like with this, public facing, document with this affirmation, we needed to give a little bit more clarity on why this affirmation is so important. And so because this explanatory paragraph has a little bit more to it, I want to go through it with you piece by piece. So let's look at the first line of the explanatory paragraph, which is this: Christians should build their understanding of Judaism on more than Christian summaries alone. So that statement is a challenge, but it also assumes a widespread problem. It is very common for Christians to draw conclusions about both ancient and modern Judaism solely from Christian summaries of Judaism. And the key word there is solely. It's not that Christian summaries of Judaism are inherently wrong. It's just that they may not give the whole picture. Again, I want to be clear. There are some excellent Christian summaries of Judaism. And when I say summaries, I mean descriptions and that handle Jewish sources very well. But the problem is that it is very common for Christian characterizations of Jews and Judaism to be deeply flawed in a negative direction. An example of this, well known, is the assumption that Judaism is a legalistic, works-based religion that promotes the idea that Jews think you earn your salvation by doing enough good works. I wonder what the real percentage is. I'm sure everybody here would have an opinion on that, but I mean, I think I would probably get a lot of agreement here that from the folks, from everybody in this meeting, that there's a very high percentage of Christians that have that assumption. Jews believe in legalism, or some shape or form of that. And so the issue here is that there is a very big problem with this common Christian assumption. And that's this: there is zero evidence that Jews in Jesus's day had this viewpoint. And Judaism today does not have this viewpoint. In other words, what Christians think Jews believe or about, the Torah and this whole connection to legalism, it's a very flawed characterization of what Jews and Judaism believe. And one of the easiest ways, and there's many ways to demonstrate why this is the case, one of the easiest ways to show how wrong this caricature of Judaism is in calling it legalistic, all you really have to do is pick up a Jewish prayer book called a Siddur. And I know many of you have Siddurs, and some of you pray, enjoy Jewish liturgy and pray the Amidah or various Jewish prayers that are really just a compilation of scripture. But if you pick up a Siddur, you will notice quickly how frequently a relationship with God is expressed with the terms, chesed, God's mercy. I mean, the word chesed, or rachamim, God's compassion, or chen, God's grace. All these terms saturate the Siddur. Pleas for forgiveness and calls for God to act according to his ahavat chesed, his loving kindness. They're everywhere in Jewish liturgy and prayer and sacred texts. So the point of this statement the point of this affirmation, and then this specific statement in the explanatory paragraph the point is not to dismiss Christian summaries of Judaism. The point is to encourage Christians to also pursue Jewish sources and Jewish people if that's practically, accessible to you. And Jewish people, if you want to learn what Jews think and what Judaism promotes. Okay? And this leads us to the next section of the explanatory paragraph here for affirmation number 5, which says, learning directly from Jewish teachers, scholars, and practitioners clarifies scripture and reconnects Christian faith to its Jewish foundations and the vibrancy of Jewish tradition. It also reminds Christians that the Torah, central to Jewish life, is the foundational revelation that grounds Christian scripture and nourishes Christian faith. Sadly, many, many Christians still have deeply ingrained negative views and reflexes of the Torah. And not just negative views of the Torah, that part of the Bible, but also of Jewish perspectives on the Torah. And I think many of you agree that this has not protected the church. It has hurt the church, not to mention the church's relationship with the Jewish people. Well, a major point that this affirmation seeks to communicate is that learning Torah and engaging the vibrancy of Jewish tradition can nourish Christian faith. So, to be clear, we are not saying that Christians should become experts in Kabbalah or in, Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law, or that you need to become a Talmudic scholar or anything like that. That's not what we're saying here. But what we are saying is that the New Testament itself affirms that all scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, training in righteousness. And of course, when that statement in 2 Timothy 3:16 was made, there was no New Testament. There was only the New Testament. So the New Testament assumes that Christ followers, Jewish or Gentile, will learn the Torah and the rest of the Old Testament, and that it's essential for spiritual growth. And the big point here is that because the Jewish people have wrestled they've wrestled with, and we've lived out the Torah for thousands of years. There is a tremendous amount that Christians can learn from Jewish people and Jewish sources regarding the first 2/3 of their Bibles. Many of you, I know, have learned from Jewish sources. Your lives are enriched from Jewish sources like Aleph Beta, Torah teachers like Rabbi Jonathan Sachs or Rabbi Manis Friedman, Rabbi David Foreman, so on and so on. And of course, older commentators like Rashi and the Rambam and the Ramban. Some of you, again, this doesn't mean that you have to be an expert in these sources, but there's a lot of wisdom in them. So friends, for Christians to dismiss the wealth of learning that is available in Judaism not only creates a distance from Jews and Judaism that the New Testament did not imagine, such a dismissal of Judaism is also a detriment to the Christian life. Again, this doesn't mean, please hear, this doesn't mean that you're going to agree with everything you read in Judaism. That's okay. But I'm sure we all know there's not everything we agree with all kinds of things we read, but we still can be enriched by them. Now, I think a good case can be made that the apostles themselves in the New Testament assumed that Gentile Christians would learn the scriptures alongside the Jewish people. I think that's assumed in Acts 15. But as we know, various dynamics and the parting of the ways between Jews and Christians have made such shared learning, the kind of shared learning I'm talking about here, it made it almost unimaginable. But things are changing. And mutual learning, whether that's with a source or with a group, there's so many opportunities today. Things are changing, and mutual learning, while respecting differences between Jews and Christians, is now becoming possible. Arguably, nobody has said this with greater clarity in recent times than Pope Francis. And I know most of the people here, I don't think everybody, but most of the people here are Protestant. But I want to bring up Pope Francis because he said something I thought that was profound, that we can all learn from. In his 2013 apostolic exhortation called Evangelii Gaudium, which is Latin for joy of the gospel. In that exhortation, speaking of the Jewish people, Pope Francis wrote this. He said, "There exists a rich complementarity which allows us to read the texts of the Hebrew scriptures together and to mine the riches of God's word." That's a beautiful statement from Pope Francis in 2013 about how Jews and Christians can together mine the riches of God's word. What a change. What an incredible, who could have imagined that even 50 years ago? But this is happening in our times. And I think it's a beautiful thing. And it's important to remember also that complementarity and shared learning can go in both directions, should go in both directions. As more in the church have and are rejecting replacement theology, a small but growing number of Jews are also promoting the importance of learning alongside Christians. In other words, it's not just Christians who can learn from Jews, but Jews can also learn from Christians. I don't know if he's on the call tonight, but Rabbi Joe Charnas is, I don't think he's with us here tonight. Joe, I don't see, he was with us here last week. He's a great example. Joe's is a conservative rabbi, and he loves learning with Christians as well, even though he's not a Christian. He's not messianic. He's a traditional rabbi. Some of you know David Nekrutman. David's another great example. David got a degree from Oral Roberts University. He's an Orthodox Jew, and he loves learning with Christians. Again, it's not just the opportunity here is not just Christians learning from Jews. There are opportunities for Jews to learn from Christians as well. But really, that can only take place safely in an environment where these kinds of affirmations are upheld. Okay, so I want to take a quick look at the final part of this paragraph before we wrap this up and then have a little bit of discussion. Last part of the paragraph here for affirmation 5, such engagement fosters genuine mutuality, a relationship marked by humble listening, honest sharing, and honoring the distinct gifts each community brings to God's story. It echoes what Krister Stendahl called holy envy, a posture of respect that welcomes Jewish wisdom, including Jewish interpretations of the New Testament and the ways its words have been heard across generations. Okay, so I had to get Krister Stendahl in this document because he's such a powerful recent Christian voice who modeled affirmation 5 so well, and really all the affirmations so beautifully. And Krister Stendahl was a Swedish theologian and the Bishop of Stockholm. And one of his 3 rules of religious understanding was the importance of holy envy, where we leave room to be inspired by elements of another person's faith that is not our own. Now, pertaining to Judaism, I think Krister Stendahl would primarily have in mind how Christians can be inspired by elements of the classic texts of Judaism. But I would say that an extension that's very important in our day of Stendahl's holy envy, this sense of respect of how we can learn from others, is for Christians to also listen to the growing number of Jewish interpreters who are engaging the New Testament deeply. We had an opportunity, some of you were there yesterday morning. Again, Rabbi Joe Charnas was my guest for our January coffee connection, where he was sharing his view of Paul, and he has engaged Paul deeply, as many of you who were there yesterday saw. And I think it's important to listen to how those texts are understood through Jewish eyes. Now, a major development and opportunity along this line is the Jewish annotated New Testament, edited by Amy Jill Levine and Mark Brettler. If you don't have that on your shelf, trust me, you need to have the Jewish annotated New Testament. This phenomenal historic volume includes every commentary. It includes commentary on every book of the New Testament by Jewish thinkers who are not Christian or Messianic. And if you don't have it, again, add it to your list. But it's an incredible opportunity to listen and to learn how Jewish thinkers engage the New Testament and Christian theology in modern times. You think about people, some of you have heard me engage with Mark Nanos and Paula Fredrickson and Pamela Eisma. Again, these are Jewish thinkers who are engaging, the New Testament in very, very deep ways. All right. So I'm going to stop there. Let me restate the 3 affirmations that we discussed tonight, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion. And I'd love to hear your questions, comments, pushback, whatever it may be. So affirmation number 3, we affirm that Judaism was not a problem that Jesus came to solve. Affirmation number 4, we affirm that using the New Testament to justify anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism is contrary to the gospel. Number 5, we affirm that authentic learning requires engaging with Jewish voices, Jewish texts, and Jewish lived experience. Hey, I would love to connect with you further, so feel free to leave a comment or send me a private message. And the best way for us to stay in touch is to sign up for the Bridge Builders Forum email at bridgebuildersforum.com. This will keep you informed of cutting-edge resources and opportunities for us to connect and learn together. Additionally, the Bridge Builders Forum is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and your support helps us create content that overcomes misunderstandings and advances ideas that build bridges between Jews and Christians. So we'll be back soon to discuss more ideas that help Jews and Christians better understand their faith, the Bible, and each other.